Welcome, everybody. I thought I'm going to start a conversation about the unexpected with a picture of a rat. This is an African giant pouch rat, which I must say, like, rats are for me the worst. But these little fellows changed my opinion somewhat. They are a hero rat. They have a superior sense of smell and can sniff out landmines fast and cheap, so they can be detonated safely. And they clear millions of square miles of land in Asia and Africa. And 2 years ago, Mozambique was declared landmine-free thanks to these rats. And what I think is really the systemic change about that, it's not just a solution that is cheap, but it's a solution that locals can literally take into their own hands, as you see in that picture. That is a local trainer that enables communities to not have to wait for expensive international aid, but take action. And here's another perhaps unexpected picture. This is a blind woman demonstrating the place of her work. She is a certified human medical touch expert working with gynecologists in Germany in this particular instance. And as you might know, sort of one of the main causes of death in women under the age of 40 is breast cancer. That is an age range where usually insurance companies don't pay for mammography. So what do? Now, blind women have been shown to be able to detect tumors faster and cheaper than doctors or machines. And turning a perceived weakness into a strength, they are now, this medical touch expert is a recognized certified profession, and they are working all over the European country. So, two unexpected ideas. The people behind them, they came up with the system and scaled it, are two Ashoka fellows. And in this case, they're called Bart Betiens and Frank Hoffman. They are 2 out of 3,500 that I work with Ashoka, have found and supported all over the world. We're sort of masters in finding the unexpected and nurture and support the social entrepreneurs behind it. And on stage with me today are 2 of them, Cristi Hegranes, the founder of the Global Press Institute, and Fagan Harris, the founder of Baltimore Corps. Thank you for being here. And let me make the picture more neutral again to focus on Cristi. Cristi, you employ women, many of them marginalized in so-called developing countries, and you turn them into journalistic contributors to CNN, to the BBC. It raises a lot of questions, but one perhaps to start with is how and why did you get this idea?
Yeah, so Global Press was not my dream job. My dream job was to be a foreign correspondent. And I just so happened to come of age at a time where the entire profession of journalism was rapidly collapsing, none more so than the specific sector of foreign correspondent, this discipline where we send elite outsiders into developing communities to tell their stories. That was my dream job. And when I was in my early 20s, I got my dream job, and I got sent to Nepal to cover the Civil War. And I was in country for about 9 days when I realized that not only was I 100% the wrong person to be doing this job, but that my dream job was bullshit. As a foreigner going into a place like Nepal, the social, historical, cultural, linguistic barriers between me and local people, and ultimately between me and the truth, were devastating. I realized in those first 9 days that what foreign correspondence does is promote false narrative. In fact, they say that 97% of foreign correspondence centers on 4 topics. Any idea what those 4 topics are? War, poverty, disaster, and disease. So it's no wonder when people in this country happen to think that the developing world is a shithole, because that's exactly the narrative that mainstream media tends to enforce. So in that moment in Nepal, I was 100% heartbroken, but I realized that I was, in fact, the wrong person to be telling the stories. Now, fast forward, Global Press was founded in 2006, and what we do is we train and employ local women in these communities to learn the principled practice of professional journalism. This is ethical, accurate, fact-checked journalism produced by local people for both local and global audiences. So everything that we produce is widely syndicated in the local community in the local language so that we are accountable to those populations, and also published and syndicated in English so that we can really elevate global awareness. Global Press, I think what's most unexpected is the fact that all of our reporters are women. Women in these communities have such incredible nuance and ability to navigate their communities. They often know, what's going on. They spot trends before other media. Their biggest barrier is actually access to elite power practitioners in their countries. And at Global Press, we've gotten around that because over the last 12 years, we've won more than 40 major journalism awards, and we reach an audience now of about 20 million people every month. So now, politicians and business owners or agents of corruption in these countries actually have no choice but to give an audience to Global Press reporters.
And you were telling me earlier today, which I thought was fascinating, about this process where you fact-checked with journalists a story in the Washington Post in this instance. It was that wasn't really right, but also wasn't wrong. Like, can you tell us?
Yeah, we refer to this phenomenon at Global Press called the reliability gap. And the reliability gap is this place in between where the truth ultimately lies, but what happens when the truth of a community is actually defined by a larger or more powerful entity. So in this live fact check process that we do as just sort of a demonstration, it's a Washington Post story where they're talking about this gentleman who lives in Masailand in Kenya, and they refer to him at one point, quick dependent clause in a sentence that says, so-and-so who is among the poorest of the poor because he lives on less than $1.42 a day, story continues, blah, blah, blah. So the reliability gap is this funny place where something can be accurate but not true. So it is actually true that this man in the story does not spend even a single dollar a day. But in a traditional pastoralist community, it's a cashless society. So it just so happens that the man they were profiling owned multiple homes, dozens of goats and cattle, crops. So he was actually extremely wealthy by his community standards. But a larger and more powerful entity decided that cash and access to cash is how we measure wealth. So journalists often fall into this reliability gap where they are going and they're fact-checking their information with the most credible or largest entities available related stats, as opposed to really understanding the root of the community. So that's what Global Press journalism does, is it provides ethical, accurate journalism, but from the viewpoint of the community.
Mm-hmm. This is fascinating. And I think it also pays testimony to the fact that social change is not easily captured in, let's say, plain numbers, right? It's like, I think it alludes to things just as mindset shift, attitudes, culture. And my question to you is that, we've heard a lot about impact investing earlier, or, philanthropy, and oftentimes we are pushed for, reporting impact in numbers and facts. How do you experience? What is impact for you?
Yeah, so it's a tough question, right? Measuring the impact of journalism is a dicey discipline. I tend to be of the impression that many journalism institutions take too much credit when social change happens, right? I don't know if you guys remember when Prop 8 passed, the New York Times wrote this long self-congratulatory email that they did it. It's like, well, you and maybe one or two other people. So it's a tricky discipline, right, is measuring the impact of journalism. So we do it in a couple different ways. We, of course, robustly measure the skill development of our reporters. We have 168 full-time reporters who receive full-time salaries, including benefits, and, of course, paid maternity leave when you employ all women. And so we measure that. We're also measuring the impact on our local audiences and looking for anecdotal evidence of change. Right, so when it comes to some of our large foundation funders, they want the analytics. We have our website for that. We have our syndication partners for that. We can absolutely demonstrate how large our readership is. But look, ultimately, readership doesn't matter unless you can demonstrate that people are taking tangible action. And that's really what we believe the best journalism does, is you read something and you change your mind about something, you take action about something, but we also know that for journalism to have tangible impact, people have to come together offline or outside of the private reading space to really have discussions. So Global Press facilitates a live event series all around the world, and we use all kinds of tools to make sure that people globally and in local communities are coming together, often across all different landscapes of an issue, to really discuss the journalism and see what kind of change can come from there.
And what is the local impact that you see, in the story of a woman, for instance, that starts working for you?
So the story of the journalists are unending. After 12 years, 88% of Global Press reporters are now the primary breadwinners in their homes. We have 100% school enrollment rate for all of our reporters, things like that. We have 12 law changes to our credit. When I say to our credit, it's that one of our stories was actually cited in the body of a law around the world in countries like Nepal and Rwanda. So measuring that impact certainly takes time, and I'm sure there's things that we're missing because a lot of it does come to us anecdotally. But the more stories we produce, the more communities we cover, the more change we know that we will act as a catalyst. And I think that really is the role of journalism, and I always encourage folks to look at independent media when they're sort of sussing out their own philanthropic portfolios, because independent journalism does act as a catalyst and a foundation for movement builders, policymakers, and analysts to actually have a really wide impact and reach.
Cool. Thank you, Cristi. Now, moving from a sort of global journalism context to a sort of hyper-local context, close to where we are in Baltimore, turning to Fagan. Fagan, you are in the broadest of ways reframing the discussion about talent in Baltimore. So tell us more about what that means and how you came into that.
Well, usually when people hear Baltimore, they say, "Have you seen The Wire?" So that's usually where we're starting. So we're trying to markedly improve from that baseline. We believe that those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. Yeah. So that's an expression that I love, that Glenn Martin, who leads Just Leadership USA, based out of New York, which is a criminal justice advocacy organization, he coined that. And I think that really captures what it is that we're about at Baltimore Core, which is we have a city that is a Black city that has incredible challenge, but also incredible opportunity. And too often, it's a city that's stigmatized and viewed through the lens of its deficits and what's wrong, as opposed to its assets and what's right and what's possible and the potential there. And I think it's particularly important because Baltimore's moment now is starting to collide with an American moment. You have the opioid epidemic that is scaled across this country that affects every race, every gender, every age, every socioeconomic class. Well, that's an issue we've dealt with for a long time in Baltimore. And if you're trying to solve that, guess where you're going to find the best practitioners on that problem? In Baltimore. So that's an example where Baltimore is on the frontier, on the leading edge of this work. And I think as we take a hard look in the mirror as a country and look at a lot of the really pressing challenges, whether it's criminal justice or education completion or overdose, you name it, we will look at these unlikely places, quote unquote, for guidance on what the solution is. When you zoom in kind of micro in Baltimore specifically, I mentioned that we're a Black city, almost 70% of the population is Black. A lot of the institutions driving change across the city, from our philanthropic institutions, our nonprofit organizations, are not actually representative of the communities that they're trying to impact, not representative of the populations that actually call those places home. And so that gets to another issue of unconscious bias in hiring, the way we exclude certain populations from opportunities, how we use oftentimes credentials as code for exclusion. Yeah. And so Baltimore Core at its essence is a human resource platform that cuts through all of that helps connect people and communities of color to really important, robust, high leverage roles of impact that gets beyond kind of traditional notions of merit and talent and reframes that in terms of people's ability to drive progress forward. That's how we define competency. How proximate can you get to this problem? How effectively can you solve it? And how can we educate and bring along our employers, our city government, our philanthropy, our community-based institutions, all the infrastructure that's working on these problems, and get to see the people and the genius that lies in the mist, that's right there in the community waiting to be tapped, waiting to be leveraged and deployed. And if we do that, we believe, and the evidence starts to bear this out, you can actually start making progress on these challenges. And you can start to win on some of these big problems. And you can start to reframe a narrative. And it's my hope that the next time I'm in London or San Francisco or New York and they say, where are you from? And I say, Baltimore, it won't be, have you seen The Wire? It'll be, I saw that you guys are really turning around on the overdose crisis, and there's something we can learn from that.
Yeah. And you said something, you're saying like, okay, Baltimore Core is like a recruiting agency and we're cutting through all this. And so how do you cut through all this? This was
Great
like,
question.
there's like, how do you get to the point where you are rewiring how people think and, and they change their lens from like, let's say a deficit focused view to an asset focused view?
Great question. We run several programs where we recruit talented people into high impact work. And take one of those programs, our fellowship. It's one of our flagship programs. We've done it for 5, almost 6 years. We'll recruit, we'll put out a call, right? And we'll canvass the community and we'll get our recruiters out there deployed locally and in the region. We'll recruit the best people we can find. And we'll assess them to what we think defines excellence in terms of performance. And we'll get 1,000 applications, let's say. And then we'll cut that list down to say, these are our 100 best, right? And then we'll build a marketplace for hiring, and we'll aggregate maybe 200 prospective employers. Baltimore City Health Department, even something more provocative like the Baltimore Police, was trying to implement the consent decree, wanted to work with us to bring that team in to do that. Baltimore City Schools, leading social entrepreneurs like Sarah Heminger, an Ashoka Fellow at Thread. And they'll hire from that pool. Well, several years ago, we kind of discovered a conundrum. Despite the fact that 100 people reflected demographics of the city, right? About 65% African American, about 30% white, 5% other, the placement rate was skewed in the other direction. And we were like, what the heck? We've qualified that. All 100 are as good. Any one of these people could walk in and do a fantastic job. What's going on? What accounts for that swing? So then we said, okay, well, let's rework the resumes. No more names, no more gender. Let's move the college and where you went to in your education. Instead of the top of the resume, let's move it to the end of the packet. And let's make sure they have to click through and actually assess on the substance the qualifications of that candidate. Boom. Placement rate, right in line with the demographics of the city. We all have bias, and we all make split-second decisions that can lead us to generate a disparate impact in the world. That's just life. That's what it means to be a human being. I think the ethics come when we structure the institutions that drive hiring and think more intentionally about that. And so we do a lot of things like that where we try to rewire the decision-making of those that have power and that are driving results so that we might get more representation, inclusion, and hopefully equity eventually in the process.
Yeah, yeah. So that actually lets me to ask a question that, both of you feel free to answer it first, perhaps to you, Fagan. So personally, on my background, I moved to the US 3 years ago from Germany, and I was really impressed by, sort of starting to understand how sort of fractured this country is, like how divided it is, and that it became clear in the election. But even before that, I remember reading a column by David Brooks in the New York Times saying, we don't is the American dream gone? Like we don't understand our own country anymore, and who are these people? In red states. So. In your experience, like how do you or what is needed to sort of reestablish trust in a way, to reestablish, empathy and enable people to come together?
I guess that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We're more segregated today than we were in 1954. And so for the history buffs out there, that's the year we did Brown v. Board as a country. So that's the year that legal segregation fell in this country. And we are more segregated by race and income today than we were in 1954. That's a profound challenge, if not the profound challenge of our time. What we find is you have to build a values-driven community, and that it's values that ends up transcending lines of difference. Mm-hmm. I think this is what you all at Ashoka do really, really well, right? Is we get a lot of really diverse people working on a set of really big problems, but what's gonna really unify us and bring us together is a certain fidelity to values. So for us, the chief value that we care a lot about is equity, specifically racial equity and gender equity and equity around sexual orientation, which is as much about representation as it is about power and thinking about power and studying power. The young man who was up here, I thought he said it so beautifully and did such a great job of modeling that. If those aren't your values, then I think it's really hard to come together over lines of difference. And so we work at that at Baltimore Core. An Ashoka fellow, effectively my business partner in Baltimore, runs an organization called Thread. We share 10,000 square feet in Mondawmin, which is the site of the unrest. So if you remember CNN and all the fires and Baltimore's burning, this is where all that happened. And so we're headquartered there in West Baltimore. And she organized a thing where we did 100 dinners across the city with an incredibly diverse swath of people for 1,000 people. So 1,000 people who didn't know each other came together and had 100 dinners, 10 people at the dinner, white, black, young, old, male, female, straight, gay, the whole bit. And I hosted one of those dinners. And we had a man there named Mark Joseph, who was an older man, very affluent, very wealthy, independently wealthy, and a young brother named Alfonso Mayo, who was working the night shift at Hopkins. And we get talking about Alfonso, and here's a guy who, was track special education in Baltimore City schools, didn't finish college until he was damn near in his 30s, has children, he's grinding, he's working an hourly wage. And we're like, well, what are you spending your time, what do you do for you? He says, well, I don't do for me. What I do is I mentor. And we need more black men in the lives of our children. We need to reconstitute our family structure through these kind of social relations. And I mentor these 4 young people, and that's what I'm doing. I actually have this organization, been running it for 7 years. Well, where do you get your funding? I am the funding. Sweat equity. I don't need funding, just doing this. Well, Mark Joseph wrote him a check on the spot, said, why don't you quit your hourly job, that's the night shift, why don't you do this full time? He doesn't serve 4 kids anymore, he serves 4 schools. All right? And so I think when people come together and there's a predicate of values, and they say, you know what, we want to invest in people who are living this work, who are doing the work, who are of the community, who are from the places greatly impacted, but we want to be an ally in that, and we understand what that means, which means checking our own privilege, checking our own power, and thinking differently about how we express change. I think magical things can happen, and I think people are attracted to the power of example. And so I think the more of that we can do it, I think that's why your work's so fabulous, the more we can shine a light on those voices and really lift that up, I think that'll inspire the rest of us to follow suit.
Absolutely. I think for me, from my particular lens, how I look at the United States, but also the whole world, is that access to information and where we choose our sources of information is a primary ingredient in that fractioning. Which is
fake news or not.
Yeah, and there's different kinds of fake news. There's fake news that's inconvenient, and there's fake news that's actually malicious actors. But what's even worse than fake news is newsrooms that do not prioritize diversity, and news consumers who do not understand that the relationship between journalism and the communities that they cover. And to me, that's one really exciting thing, because every single one of us can retool our news consumption habits. And you can ask questions, right? Every story you see about Baltimore on CNN or in the New York Times or the Associated Press, who is that reporter? Where's the dateline? Is the dateline Washington, D.C., meaning that some reporter phoned it in from D.C. because they didn't want to go to West Baltimore? Is that reporter black or white? Is that reporter young or old? And I think if we actually start asking these questions and holding our news agencies to a higher account, they actually have no choice but to change, because they're broke and they need your subscription dollars. So you're actually quite a powerful change agent when it comes to media in the United States. And we have a really particular sickness here with how we consume information, right? You have CNN people and Fox News people. And what's so unique about that is all around the world, news organizations have political affiliations, but citizens in these places choose to consume multiple types of outlets. Right, Zimbabwe is my favorite example, where historically the majority of media in Zimbabwe is owned by ZANU-PF, formerly Bob's party, now Emerson's party. But what people in Zimbabwe do is they'll consume 4, 5, 6 different media outlets a day with this idea that, okay, if I can just piece together all of these frameworks, then maybe I can understand my own community better. We don't do that here, and it's a really easy change that all of us can make.
Thank you. And I think it reminds me of something like when we are, from Ashoka's perspective, when we are looking at, all our fellows and almost like hold the cases against the light and see what kind of pattern we are seeing. We are seeing that this sort of having empathy with the other side and trying to get people from all different walks of life to come together and work together on solutions, like what you are doing across space and you are doing in Baltimore, is like a really strong pattern that we're seeing that encourages people to step up, be a change maker, and work with others across the aisle, on a solution for the good of all. And we have to wrap up, but I wanted to ask you one last question. Knowing that the overall theme is philanthropy here, like what advice would you give to sort of, budding philanthropists, to those who actually, want to give, or also those who want to contribute? Like, what are the pitfalls that you say, avoid that, and, what might some of the, do's be that you would put forward?
2 things really quickly. One, like I said, consider adding independent journalism into your portfolios. Getting good journalism out there about the topics that you care most about, whether that's the environment or international development, is a great strategy. The second, I would say, is to utilize networks like Ashoka, who have an extraordinary diligence process, and so you don't have to reinvent the wheel when you're looking for grantees. There are real experts out there who have really done a great job in finding extraordinary change makers.
I agree with all of that. The only thing I would add is the logic of scale and the logic of getting ROI and putting dollars to work where it's already at scale and that it's a known quantity and you're going to see a return on that. While I certainly understand it and I believe in a lot of cases it's important, I will point out that it's very exclusionary for new voices and new identities, and that there are a lot of people that look like the communities they're trying to impact or of the communities they're trying to impact, but by definition, they're at the very beginning or in the early stages of their work. And who is there to take a risk on them, and who is there to invest in them so that one day they might drive scale, and that scale qualitatively might feel different by virtue of who's leading it. And so something that we're insanely passionate about is getting into the grassroots and getting into community and finding people like Alfonso who are doing that work and resourcing them and building teams around them. And what will happen is they will surprise you. They will adapt and they will learn and they will find that best practice and they will scale up and they will build infrastructure, and that will be very important, except when they get there, the force of their example is going to be so powerful. And so they need champions and they need allies. So I hear a lot about data, numbers, and metrics, and I get it, and we do it, and we can, love it. It's awesome. But that at the expense of getting close to the people of the work and for the work and in the work, I think is dangerous. And I think we're in a moment as a country where we can't afford dangerous. We've got to go to where the people are, and we've got to give them the resources.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
This is awesome.